Good afternoon and welcome to the Independent Sage Friday briefing. Now, we know that COVID is airborne, and as we learn to live with the virus, that doesn't mean entirely surrendering to its presence. Rather, our behaviours and our environments can adapt. As Independent Sage has said consistently, investing in cleaner air indoors is one of the best ways to reduce transmission and enable people to mix more safely. So today we'll be discussing the importance of clean air ventilation and the additional measures needed to avoid future surges. So we're very lucky to be joined for this session by Trish Greenhalgh, Professor of Primary Care Health Sciences at the University of Oxford, and Dr. Adam Squires, a biophysical chemist and aerosol specialist at the University of Bath. Professor Christina Pargel will be leading the discussion with them shortly, but first she's going to take us through the latest numbers. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you. Right, let me share my screen. Right, so I hope you can all see that. There's quite a lot to cover this week, but I'm hoping to go through it quite quickly. And it's basically going to cover vaccination, cases, a new subvariant, hospitals, deaths, and then children and schools. So just on vaccination, this is the number of first, second and booster doses given by day. And you can see that really since the new year, numbers have dropped off a cliff and we're doing very, very few vaccinations now. And it's not because we finished our programme. We haven't finished. So we've got somewhere between 50 and 60% of the population boosted and still about 20% without any dose. And just wanted to highlight that Northern Ireland has the lowest booster coverage and the highest proportion of people without a single dose. And you'll see why that's relevant in a minute. Before we look at cases, I just wanted to look at testing. So the next plot will show the 7-day average of the number of lateral flow tests done every day and of the PCR tests done every day. So brown is lateral flow tests and PCRs, and black is the PCR test. Now, for the lateral flow tests, it's only if you take it and then report that result, either negative or positive, to the dashboard. If you don't report it, you will not appear on this figure. And you can see a big bump in LFD testing just before Christmas, and another massive bump on the back to school, back to work in the new year. On the second week of January, the requirement to do, or the recommendation to do a confirmatory PCR test was no longer required. And you can see that really since then, over the last few weeks, PCR testing has dropped off a cliff. And it's not because cases have plummeted. So what this means is that we're really relying on people reporting their own tests if they're using lateral flow tests. And it also means that the way we calculate positivity has only ever been with PCR. And as fewer people are doing those, it means that our positivity rate estimates really mean something a bit different now. And I'm not quite sure what it means yet. So if we look at positivity rates, the other thing is that Northern Ireland has changed how it calculates them. So it's no longer comparable to the other home nations. So it's not on this plot. But you can see this massive spike with Omicron at the end of the year, last year. And then really over the last few weeks, positivity rates from PCR tests have been completely flat. And if we look at Northern Ireland, you can see that they had a big spike, but positivity rates have actually started increasing quite rapidly in Northern Ireland over the last couple of weeks. So if we now look at cases by date of test, so this is if you tested positive by home nation, you can see that that is reflected here, that cases are showing as flat for England, Wales and Scotland, but increasing in Northern Ireland. And the other thing that happened at the beginning of this week was the reinfections started being included in the England and Northern Ireland figures. So if you test positive more than, sorry, I should say not within 90 days, more than 90 days after your first test, you are now included as a new case of COVID. For Wales, it was more than 42 days, so more than 6 weeks difference. And they're not yet in the Scottish data. So this is all a bit of a mess, but it's really good that they're starting to include this. If we just look at England, we can see what impact that has made. So blue is first infections and orange are kind of confirmed reinfections. And you can see that once Omicron is dominant, you see a lot more reinfections appearing in the data. So there's hardly any orange in the Delta period, and now about 10% of daily cases of people getting COVID again that we know of for sure. So that's kind of the difference that missing out those reinfections was making. The pattern is the same, but the numbers are higher now that we include reinfections. So just coming back to this plot, what it also suggests is if you just look at the case numbers, it looks as if Scotland and Wales are kind of back to where they were with Delta in this kind of long period of high but stable infection. And England is stable but higher, and the Northern Ireland is going up. Now, if we look at the Office of National Statistics Infection Survey, which tests people randomly every week, and their latest data up to the 26th of January, you can see a slightly different picture. So yes, England is kind of high and flat, and Northern Ireland is going up a lot. So that kind of matches the case data. Wales has gone up and Scotland has gone up, but they're also high. And if you look at the ONS data from November, December, actually nations were between 1.5% and 2 and a bit percent. So every nation is way higher than it was in October, November. So there is this kind of mismatch between what the ONS data is showing us and the case data is showing us. Now, they are measuring slightly different things and at slightly different times, but the difference should not be quite that high. And then you have the Zoe Symptom Tracker app run by King's College, where people log symptoms every day. It's been running for almost 2 years now. And they had just released a press release this week saying that they're seeing new reports of symptoms back up to where they were almost at the peak, almost at 200,000 cases a day, which is entirely not what we're seeing in the case data. And again, we don't know, Zoe has its own issues, but we're basically now in a situation where the 3 different ways of measuring are giving you different pictures, and we don't really know which one is real. So Omicron subvariants, I just want to mention this briefly. So the Omicron that we've all been talking about for the last 6 weeks or 8 weeks is BA.1. And there are 2 other subvariants. There's BA.1.1, which is basically Omicron with an extra mutation that makes it a little bit more immune resistant. And then there's a kind of a brother of Omicron called BA.2. And BA.2 is now dominant in Denmark. And from a Danish study released this week, they have said that they think it's inherently substantially more transmissible than BA.1 and a little bit more immune evasive. The UK Health Security Agency also published an analysis of BA.2 last week, and they also find that it does seem to be inherently more transmissible. It does infect more people than Omicron. If we look at Denmark, where it's dominant, you can see that cases, this was kind of their BA.1 phase, and this is their BA.2 phase. You can see that cases are really high. And this week they've been reporting numbers of cases that if they were in the UK would be well over 500,000 cases. So really, really high numbers of cases. But if you look at what that means for hospitalizations and deaths in Denmark, you're seeing high numbers of people in hospital, but actually rapidly falling numbers of people in ICU. So it does seem as if BA.1 and BA.2 is similar to BA.1 in that it doesn't cause as much severe illness and it doesn't need people to be in ICU. However, deaths from Omicron or with Omicron are still going up in Denmark, although nowhere near the rate they would be if it was Delta. So it's not as if it has no bad impact. It does have bad impact, but it certainly doesn't seem to be any more severe than BA.1. In England, you can see kind of what's been going on. We started off with BA.1, then it's kind of its daughter variant BA.1.1 started gaining ground, but now BA.2 is out competing both of them and growing quite rapidly, is 6% at the most recent week. And again, if you look at each nation, it's growing everywhere, but in Northern Ireland, which only has data up to the 22nd of January, it's actually kind of 20% of sequence cases there. And again, that could partly explain why Northern Ireland is seeing more rapid growth than the other home nations, although it's still kind of quite early days. And in terms of regions of England, again, as Omicron came, the same with BA2, it's mainly concentrated in London and the southeast, and in the east of England and the East Midlands and the southwest. And so the northern England doesn't have it as much, but it's pretty inevitable that it will eventually become dominant in every region in England and every country in the UK. And there's another really interesting report that came out of ONS this week looking at reinfections. And I just want to highlight this because people talk about Omicron being mild and this inevitable evolution of mildness. And I think sometimes people think it means that eventually we just won't know when we get it and it'll be fine. And so what they looked at was when you get tested, so on the single day that you get tested by the ONS infection survey, they ask you if you have symptoms. And so what they did is they asked people, they kind of compared the chance of someone saying they've got symptoms for whether they had a first infection by variant or it was their second confirmed infection. And so this is showing, this plot is showing your chance of saying you've got symptoms if it's your first infection with Delta, if it's your second infection and you've got Delta, or if it's your second infection and you've got Omicron. And the first thing to say is that for both Delta and Omicron, infections were much more likely to be symptomatic than Alpha, which is the variant we had a year ago and caused the really terrible second wave. So it's not the case that as variants evolve, you suddenly see fewer people being symptomatic. That isn't the case. And then the second thing to take away from this is that second infections, whether it was Delta or Omicron, are just as likely to be symptomatic as the first infection. So even though it is likely that prior infection protects you from severe illness, it doesn't mean that you don't get sick. Looking at hospital data, the number of people in hospital in all the nations is going down, and that is a good thing. And I think that is really the booster program kicking in and doing its job, and the fact that cases did peak in early January and are now falling. It's really driven by adults not needing hospital as much. That said, the number of NHS staff off is still high and much higher than it's been in previous years, including the peak a year ago in January 2021. So you can see currently over 7% of NHS staff are off absent. And so, you know, we're still seeing a situation where even though we're kind of moving on with our lives and the kind of conversation is it's over, we're still seeing an NHS that is very strained. And I just wanted to mention deaths. So if we look at deaths by reporting date, this week there was one day when over 500 deaths were reported. And that was really widely in the media and people saying, oh my God, we're back at over 500 deaths. But this is a misleading figure. You know, you shouldn't be concentrating on just a single day of reporting because it is subject to backlogs, which is exactly what happened in this situation. You can see the 7-day average is actually pretty flat. If we look at deaths by date of actual death, you'll see we've never been anywhere near 500 in this wave. What we have seen is an increase in deaths. We have got to about 300 deaths a day. It does seem that we might have just about peaked, or at least not going up anymore. But nonetheless, it's still the highest since February 2021, but it isn't 500 a day. And it isn't just incidental deaths. From the ONS death registration, the latest data shows that deaths involving COVID still rising and have risen in the week to 21st of January, where there was almost 1,500 deaths. And in 3/4 of those involving COVID is the main cause of death. So it's not that Omicron hasn't caused an increase in deaths, it has. And finally, just a word on children and schools. This is cases per 100,000 people per week for the different age groups in England up to the 29th of January. And from this, you kind of get a mixed picture of cases starting to fall in primary school children where it's been incredibly high, flattening off in 10 to 14-year-olds, and kind of but flat in people over 60. And if we compare this to ONS, again, you kind of see a different picture. You see that it's not that, if you look here, the rates of 10 to 14-year-olds and 5 to 9-year-olds aren't that different. If we look at ONS, you're seeing almost twice as many primary school children affected as secondary school children. So there is kind of an ascertainment issue there. And if the case data is accurate, we should see this start to fall next week with ONS, because ONS is kind of a bit lagged. But Zoe, the symptom tracker app, is still showing up in January, massive increases in both children and their parents. And so we're kind of, again, seeing this quite opposite pictures from two different ways. So ONS is kind of the gold standard, and we won't know until next week kind of which of these are showing a more accurate picture. And high infections in children, this kind of persistent high infections that we've had for the last 8 weeks, does matter, and it is causing more hospitalizations. Record numbers of children have been in hospital with Omicron compared to previous waves, and we're still seeing persistently high numbers of children admitted. And then we've also seen increasing rates of long COVID in both children and school staff. In fact, people working in the education sector are one of the highest occupational groups for long COVID, and it's been increasing. The ONS also released the vaccination update this week. They've really been releasing quite a lot of stuff. And that's just showing that first doses aren't that high in 12 to 15-year-olds or 16, 17-year-olds, and second doses are very low. 12 to 15-year-olds have only just become eligible, but you do really need that second dose for Omicron. And 16 and 17-year-olds aren't getting their second dose at the rate they were getting their first dose. So we really have to kind of address this. And we're also seeing this persistent difference in vaccine uptake by deprivation. So this is looking at schools that are eligible for free school meals. And schools in the richest areas have much higher uptake of vaccination compared to schools in the poorest areas. And then they also asked children who had been vaccinated why they wanted to be vaccinated. So for 12 to 18-year-olds, people who'd been vaccinated, the most common motivations were protecting others and then protecting themselves. And so I think that's quite interesting, just because when JCVI considered vaccination, they explicitly do not consider the kind of knock-on benefit of reducing transmission. But it's quite interesting to me that for teenagers, that's actually a really important motivation. And they also don't particularly want to get COVID. And for children who are 5 to 11, 62% of their parents said that they were fairly or very likely to take the vaccine if offered. It isn't currently offered, but there certainly is not the case that parents don't want to vaccinate their children. And just finally on ventilation, which ONS also released data on this week, 29% of secondary schools said that good ventilation was very challenging to implement. And one of the major reasons is that it was too cold, basically. Most schools are doing things to try and improve ventilation. They're opening windows and doors and leaving internal doors open. Almost half of secondary schools have mechanical ventilation, but only about a quarter of primary schools do. But there is still an issue within schools of not having enough CO2 monitors. So over half of head teachers said they don't have enough CO2 monitors in communal areas, staff-only areas, or classrooms. And then when they are using them, about 10% of rooms had consistently red readings, so dangerous levels or poor ventilation, with no way of improving it. And almost a quarter of head teachers said they hadn't received any guidance on how to use CO2 monitors in their schools. So just to summarise, reported cases are flat in all home nations apart from Northern Ireland, where they're going up. ONS reports kind of less of a fall than reported cases, and Zoe symptom tracker app is reporting an increase. Reinfections are now included, but not consistently, and 90 days might be too long an interval. If you got Delta in November or December and Omicron in January, you would not appear as a reinfection. So the whole thing is a little bit of a mess right now and quite hard to interpret. Hospital admissions are coming down overall, driven by adults, but they remain high in children. Deaths have been increasing, but look to have peaked at the end of January. A new variant is increasing in many countries and across the UK. BA2, it definitely looks like it's more transmissible, but not more severe. We don't know yet whether it can evade immunity from recent BA1. So basically, people who got Omicron in December or early January, are they likely to get BA2 in February and March? We don't know, hopefully not. But either way, it will become dominant here at some point. Infection remains rampant in schools, and we need more vaccination and more mitigations, including clean air, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute. And, you know, it's not just about schools. So, you know, coronavirus is still mutating, and it's getting plenty of opportunities to do it. We're seeing record levels of infection across the world right now, millions of new infections every week. And adapting to new waves as new variants emerge must mean accepting that it's airborne and then doing something about the fact that it's airborne. And there are things we can do about it. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So I'm going to stop sharing and now kind of move over to Prof. Trish Greenhalgh and Dr. Adam Squires. And so I'm just going to start by asking Adam, you know, what do people mean when they say coronavirus is airborne?
So airborne diseases in general are all transmitted in essentially the same way. So people, all of us, all the time, give out particles when we breathe out, more when we talk or sing loudly. And the particles, they're made of our own sort of respiratory fluids, they're sort of made of us. And when they come out into the air, then they're small enough so they can stay floating in the air. And smoke is a very good kind of visual metaphor to help understand. So smoke particles, like our exhaled particles, gradually fill the air. And if the person breathing out or talking has COVID, then the pathogen, the coronavirus or the bacteria or virus for other diseases as well, it hitches a ride on these particles. And when someone else breathes the particles in, then that's how they get infected. And
so what does that mean for like droplet transmission versus aerosols, that people talk about that?
Right. So it all gets quite confusing, because if a very tiny droplet can float in the air, well, it's still a droplet, but we think of bigger droplets in a different way. So the original droplet idea of like a kind of drop of spit that sort of flies through the air and lands on the ground, that was a kind of original model. And that was one of the reasons for thinking, well, if you're 2 meters away or more, your sort of drop of spit isn't going to go any further, so you're definitely safe. So the original droplet model was that these are kind of globs of spittle, fly through the air, land on the ground quickly, 2 meters keeps you safe. If it's small enough so it floats in the air like smoke, then that changes things in a few ways. And the first one is distance. So 2 meters doesn't become a COVID can't get you magic barrier, but distance still helps. And again, if you think of a smoker, if you're closer to a smoker, there'll be more smoke near them. And smokers do sort of breathe out a jet of smoke, and people breathing out or talking give off a jet of air, which will have particles that may have COVID in. So getting further away still helps, even from an airborne disease like COVID. It gets you out of the place where they're still breathing in your face. So the idea of it being airborne gets into the idea where getting more than 2 meters away isn't a magic bullet anymore, but it gradually stays in the air and fills the air up. And this will then make it more and more likely people breathe it in, unless we do something to get the particles back out of the air to clean the air.
Okay, so with airborne, it means that duration also really matters. Like the longer you're in a room, the more the whole room will get contaminated. So, Trish, what does that kind of mean for protecting each other from being affected if it's airborne?
Yeah, so the first thing to say is that I don't think this is all that hard conceptually. I think people have said it's really complex and it's really difficult. It's not. We all know what breathing is. Breathing brings air into your lungs. And if there's virus in that air, it's going to get into your lungs. That's maybe why the lungs are so badly affected by COVID. Now, what we need to do is we're going to talk later, I think, about the measures to clean the air in, for example, school classrooms or other buildings. But I want to talk a little bit about masks. If you're wearing a mask, it does three different things. The first thing it does is it catches a lot of the virus, if you've got virus, as you're breathing out, because the air that you exhale has got to go through the mask. Of course, if you're not wearing a very well-fitted mask, it will come out around the sides, so that's not very good. So a well-fitting, high-filtration mask will stop an awful lot of the virus getting into the air. And if you might have heard the expression N95, that's supposed to stop 95% of the virus going through. That's equivalent to, broadly equivalent to an FFP2 in Europe. The N95 is a sort of American standard. So that's the first thing it does, is it stops the vast majority of viral particles even getting into the air. And that's another word for that is source control. The second thing a mask does is if you're not infected, but other people in the room are, and there's virus floating in the air, you, of course, don't want to breathe in that virus. So the mask stops the virus from crossing into your mouth and nose and therefore entering your lungs. So it protects you if you're not infected. The third thing that the mask does is it demonstrates to everybody that you're taking the pandemic seriously. You might be clinically vulnerable. You might have really good reasons why you don't want to catch it. And I'm giving you a message that I care about you. So I think the idea of wearing masks is really, really important. We don't have to wear them all the time, everywhere, forever. But in places where the risk of transmission is very high, so when there's high prevalence of the disease locally, when you're indoors, when you can't avoid lots of people, and as Adam and Christina have said, when you're close to other people, and when you're staying for a long time, that combination of risk is when it would be most advisable for everybody to be wearing high filtration, well-fitting masks.
Right, so masks are kind of really good to kind of stop the air getting dirty, and then if it is dirty, if you like, or contaminated, then to protect you as well. But are there ways then, like, how do we make the air cleaner? Ads, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so there's different ways that if we can't be outdoors, we have to be indoors to stop the level of infectious aerosol building up. So broadly speaking, there's three categories: ventilation, filtration, and killing the virus with something like ultraviolet. And these kind of move to like things we can easily control as individuals through to changing the buildings. So ventilation is diluting out the exhaled air with fresh air from outdoors. So this is what most schools are relying on at the moment, with opening windows. That's called natural ventilation. There's also mechanical systems with fans and ducts that the building itself will have plumbed in, which produces the same kind of idea. So that's ventilation. Filtration is where, for various reasons, if you can't get enough outside air in, or the outside air isn't clean enough itself, you can run the air itself in the room through a filter. And we know this filtration efficiency is well known for this HEPA technology. It's been used for decades. It filters out all of the particles on the size that we breathe out, speak out, and carry the viruses. So with this filtration technology, with these HEPA filters, they showed in Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge on an actual COVID ward with COVID infectious patients, and they could basically clean out all the air, all of the particles inside the air using these filters. And this is what there's a lot of discussion about, getting these in schools. These are also things that people can buy themselves. They're sort of £50 to £100 home cleaning, air cleaning devices that you plug in. And then the third option is you leave the particles there, but you kill the virus inside the particles, so it's no longer infectious. And that's a process called germicidal irradiation, usually done with ultraviolet light. So that's a more sort of specialist technology. You couldn't sort of buy this and put this up yourself, but they're increasingly talking about it for more and more public buildings, because you can kill all the virus in a lot more air, a lot more efficiently than you can usually through filtration. So those three ideas are always, so there's less infectious virus floating in the air and less for people to breathe in.
Right. And so kind of if we're thinking about indoor spaces and how safe they are, how does it depend on kind of where you are and what you were doing? So like, Trish, do you want to talk to this? And I'll share your slide that you sent me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, all models and diagrams are a bit of an oversimplification, but Christina's about to put up something called the COVID risk chart. And if you put COVID risk chart, all one word, into Google, you'll find this. You can find it in actually about 40 different languages as well, because people translated it. And as I say, it is a bit of an oversimplification. We've done a bit of mathematics on it to actually quantify these risks, but the red, amber, and the green broadly correspond to very risky, moderately risky, and less risky. And if I take you through it, each of these cells represents a different situation. So if you go into the top left green box, you can see that this is when you're outdoors. Obviously, it's well ventilated. Most outdoor spaces are, unless you're in a sort of football stadium or something like that, where you're catching the direct jet of someone. But let's say you're outdoors in the park or something. You're not speaking. You're silent. You're wearing face coverings, and you're only in contact with someone else for a short period of time. That's about the safest thing you can be doing. And then if you go right down to the bottom right, the worst possible thing you can do. What we've got here is that you're in a poorly ventilated space. It's high occupancy. In other words, there's a lot of people in that space. And let's say you're all shouting and singing, and you're not wearing masks. So that's very, very risky, especially with the Omicron variant, which is now pretty much the only game in town at the moment in the UK. It's highly, highly transmissible. You really don't need very many particles of Omicron to become infected. So you can see in the middle of this, you've got various different other situations. But broadly speaking, what we're talking about is the longer you are indoors with lots of people, the more noise you're making, and the more you're puffing and panting. Actually, we've added another row to the latest version of this, which is whether you're exercising, the more risky it is. And therefore, the more important it is to be wearing masks.
Great. Thank you for taking us through that. Az, I don't know if you want to add anything to what Trish was just saying.
No, I think that summarised it pretty well. And again, thinking about smoke and times when you'd be most likely to be breathing in a lot of smoke versus not is a pretty helpful idea. So if you imagine everyone who's unmasked, and especially if they're talking loudly, if they're smoking in that environment, the more you think, well, I'd be breathing in smoke, coming home with my clothes smelling of smoke, that's probably a higher risk. Whereas if you're going for an outdoor walk, for example, even if the person you're with is smoking, it's pretty unlikely you'll end up with much smoke on.
Yeah, and in fact, the smoking analogy is quite good for the other thing that various members of the cabinet keep saying is masks are important when you don't know the person, which doesn't make any sense. If someone's infected, it doesn't matter how well or how little you know them. The difference between knowing and not knowing someone is that people that you live with or that you've arranged to meet, you have some control over their potential infection status, is that you know, for instance, you might all agree to test, or you know that they're vaccinated or whatever. So that's the difference between knowing and not knowing people. But the idea that somehow if you know someone well, they can't infect you is obviously complete rubbish. I feel like I just have to say that.
Yeah, can I just come in here, Christina? I know that this message and the COVID risk chart is kind of troubling for people, and I can completely understand that. When the things that you really enjoy are in the bottom right-hand corner of the chart. So, for example, people who are religious and who go to the church or the synagogue or mosque or whatever, when there's a lot of people gathering together, that's part of it, and you might be singing or chanting, etc. What do we do about things like that, or people who go to nightclubs or like to go to restaurants? Now, there's a number of things that we need to take into account. Firstly, if you're vaccinated, if everybody's vaccinated or almost everyone's vaccinated, the chance that there's going to be viral particles in the air is going to be less, but not abolished. But also, all buildings need the people who own or manage those buildings need to get their heads around how can we work towards clean air, high quality air in those buildings. And certainly, I was on the radio a few months ago, and there was someone from the nightclub industry saying, do you know how hard we're working to install good ventilation systems in nightclubs, which, guess what, are often underground with not many windows. Actually, they're working quite hard on it. But as Christine has already said, the thing about a lot of these things when you're going out is you don't know whether or not people are vaccinated, whether or not they've done a lateral flow test before they've attended. And often you really don't know how well ventilated the building is. And you can't just take your CO2 monitor in there, because if there's a filtration system, the CO2 levels might be high, but it may still be, the air might be fairly clean because it's gone through the filter.
So I think I'll make this the last question so we have time for questions from the audience. So I'm just going to ask, now that all the mask mandates have been dropped, and we're kind of being encouraged to go back to normal life, go to work, all the rest of it, what can people do as kind of individuals in this situation? So Adam?
So I guess this is where there's the interesting distinction between people you do know and people you don't know. The people that you do know are probably going to be in situations where you're more likely to not want to wear a mask, partly because you have the more social interaction face to face and you're more likely to be eating and drinking. And that's the particularly riskier scenario, and the one where ventilation doesn't help as much. So again, in the metaphor, if someone's across the table from you having a cigarette, blowing smoke in your face, opening a window, it helps a bit, but you're still going to get smoke in your face. And that's the regime where, at least if they're people you can then rely on all these other things like testing, like conversations about agreeing to test beforehand. For people that you don't know, so I'm thinking in a restaurant, people on the other tables, well, at least if they're further away, if the place was well ventilated, then that's less of an issue. But yeah, I guess a lot now comes back to masks, which then comes back to Trish.
Yeah. So Trish, do you want to have the final word?
Yeah, sure. So I am still wearing a mask when I go into any building. If I go into work, if I go into a shop, etc. And the reason why I have actually upgraded my mask to a respirator, to an FFP2, which is equivalent to N95, the reason why I've done that is that the high grade mask is much more likely to protect the wearer. It also protects everybody else, but if fewer people are wearing masks, and if you go into a supermarket in some places, nobody's wearing masks except you. So it's even more important for your own protection to be wearing one, especially if you are clinically vulnerable, or if you live with someone who's clinically vulnerable. So there's really no doubt about this. The science is very, very strong that a high quality, high grade respirator, which fits you well, is the best way of protecting yourself from inhaling viral particles from the air.
Great, thank you. And just before we go back to Hannah, I just want to say that in the States, President Biden is now sending out something like 400 million high-grade masks to be freely picked up from pharmacies for everybody because of this. So anyway, back to Hannah for questions.
Thank you so much, Christina, Trish and Adam, for that very informative discussion. So we're now going to take questions from the press and the public. So first up, Rebecca Nye has been in touch. Rebecca, are you with us now?
Hi, yes.
Hello. Hello.
Lovely to join you. I'm curious to know about the level of protection afforded by a HEPA air filtration machine in my home. So I'm an immunosuppressed, clinically extremely vulnerable mum. So I've got a teenager going into school. My husband goes into university teaching students. So they're a risk to me. And we have these rush dinners with the windows and doors open to kind of keep the air blowing in, or we sit nervously at the opposite sides of the room to watch TV together. But we've now bought a machine, and I'm sitting looking at it thinking, so how much safer am I now? Or could I have just saved the money and kept the windows open?
Adam, this one might be for you.
Okay. Well, first, that sounds like a stressful situation all round. This is a very good question. I would say the very first approximation, it's like having an extra window open. So it's not that it suddenly changes to we're now safe. It's just safer than it was without the HEPA, and that's safer than with another window closed, if that helps. All of it, the distance helps, as I say, so that you're doing the right thing in, as well as having your windows open and your HEPA on, having people at opposite ends of the room helps too. And having the HEPA device sort of in amongst you and not on the floor if you can also helps. So it all helps. Sorry, did I gloss over that a bit too quickly? You get better general air coming in to the filter and being filtered if it's a bit raised up rather than on the floor, apparently. So if you put it on a coffee table in amongst you, then that all helps, but it's sort of like an extra window open.
Thank you.
Rather than a sudden kind of magic bullet. That helps.
Thanks, Adam. And Tris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, well, what a dreadful situation to be in. But actually, I just wanted to point out something really quite positive here is that the people you're sharing a room with quite obviously are people who love you and care about you and who are also highly motivated to protect you. And therefore, they're cooperating with the science. And, you know, that's actually something that I know we talk about living room transmission, but actually in this particular living room, your loved ones are trying to make it as safe as possible. And that's not always the case when, for example, you go to a restaurant. I'm assuming you're all well vaccinated. I think the only other thing I'd add to what Adam said is have a little bit more emphasis on the duration that you're all in the room together. I love the idea of the family sitting down watching the TV together, but kind of at opposite ends of the room. Maybe when it's tea break time in the adverts time in the program, you could open the windows and everybody go off and wander to opposite ends of the house and really give that room a bit of a flushing out and then go back. That's another thing that's been shown to help. So, yeah, good luck.
Could I add one more HEPA comment? This might seem obvious, but the HEPA normally comes, the filter that's inside the HEPA comes pre-wrapped in a plastic bag that you need to take it out of the plastic bag and put it back in. More than one qualified scientist I know has forgotten to do that. So I thought I'd better mention it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for getting in touch, Rebecca, with that important question. And thank you to Tris and Adam for all of those practical tips. So we've also had Marie Mestra, who's been in touch with a question about her daughter's school. Is Marie there?
Hello.
Hello,
Good
Marie.
afternoon. Hi. My daughter attends primary school, and we had a recent COVID outbreak. the Parent Association is trying to buy HEPA filters, but we don't know if they have the capacity, depending on the room size, to filter the air, or even whether this will be a good measure for this type of setting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Tris or Adam, would you like to volunteer for?
I'm going to hand over to Adam because this is not my specialty. I mean, it's a highly technical thing, this, and you need to get advice on which particular filter you need for which particular room. There are websites, and I think we should probably put one on the IndySage websites. There are sites where you can kind of look up and put in your room volume and things like that. But there isn't a quick, oh, get one of these, it'll be all right. I'm going to hand over to Adam now.
Yes, and I'll try and push back to the. It's still not that. It's not as complicated as it might seem. So the first thing is, if you don't get the HEPA for the powered enough for that room, I mean, it's half as powerful, then you'll just get half as much clean air as you would, but it's still better than not having it. So it's sort of like having a small window rather than a large window. So it's all good. There is a website calculator where you can put in the volume of the room, and it tells you how much clean air you get out. The main things to look at, if you do, I will, IndySage will post a link to that. The main thing is, all they do, as long as it's just doing the filtration, so avoiding, there's some that do sort of ionizing that you want to avoid that. So just filtration. HEPA that says H13 or H14, which is the standard saying the filter bit's good enough. The only other thing that counts is really how much clean air you're getting out every hour. It blows a certain amount of clean air into your room, and the website that sells it will tell you how much that is. There's a very rough sort of calculation. If you know how many people are going to be in the room, even if you don't want to sort of measure it up, one ballpark is 20 meters cubed per hour for every person in the room. So you multiply that up, you buy enough HEPA to do that much clean air every hour, then that's you.
I told you it was complicated.
Sorry. But if you don't get the right amount, because normally people say, well, we can't afford that. If you get half as much, then it's like, well, that's still good. It's not as good as it would have been, but my quick calculation was sort of maybe a bit of an ideal. But again, it's like opening windows. If you open not as many windows, that's still better than not. So I'd say it's the same with HEPA.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marie, for getting in touch with that question. And as Adam says, we'll put the link to the calculator and the website information in the comments section for Independent Sage under the video. Thank you. Okay, so there's also been a question that's come in from David Jones. So he's writing in saying there was a recent study indicating COVID loses 90% of its ability to infect within 20 minutes in the air. So given this is only one study and it's a preprint, how should we all interpret these findings? So does it mean that we could put greater priority on mask wearing and physical distancing and less priority on ventilation, such as the HEPA filters? Adam?
So if that's the study I'm thinking of from Bristol, it's a beautiful study where they levitated a single particle with an electric field. It's a very challenging experiment, and you couldn't do it with a real exhaled material. So there's a few different reasons why with beautiful experiments like that, you can't directly replicate the real world. Mm-hmm. So I would certainly, that particular feature of exactly how long the exact time scale that the virus lasts, I think you would want, more studies with the stuff people actually breathe out. So I think it was a beautiful experiment, interesting finding compared the time with other similar experiments. But in terms of behavioral change, I think you wouldn't, partly because any given person breathes out huge amounts of different. Some breathe out a lot more, some breathe out a lot less. The virus might last a lot longer, might last a lot less, depending on the room. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's anything you'd say, well, now because of that study, we do differently.
Thank you. And Tris?
Yeah, I would completely agree. We do know, because other studies have shown, that if you walk into a room where there's been, for example, a very sick patient with COVID in a hospital room, and they've gone out of that room a couple of hours ago, it is possible to still catch COVID from walking into that room. But there's a more general point here. The word preprint means something that someone has uploaded onto the internet and it hasn't been checked. It hasn't been what we call scientifically peer reviewed. And so we should never change our individual behavior or change policy on the basis of one single preprint. It's possible to fast track these studies if they're really, really, really hugely important. It's possible to fast track them through peer review very quickly. But if it's sitting on a preprint server, as Adam says, it sounds like an amazing, interesting experiment. But that doesn't mean we're safe after 20 minutes.
Thank you. That's a really important point, Tris. Thank you. Okay, so Janice Plant has also been in touch. Janice, are you here?
Yes.
Hello. Welcome.
Hello. Now then, and my question is the scores on the door scheme likely to happen? Because my dad's 96 and he's been shielding since March 2020. It'd be nice to think we could take him out to eat in a pub or wherever, know that the air is clean, like they do in Japan. That's basically it.
Thank you. So Independent Sage discussed and I think presented the idea of schools on doors as a concept maybe 3 months ago. And Chris or Adam, have you got any comment on this at all for Janice?
Well, I think it's actually Steve Reicher would be a really good person.
I was about to bounce this to Susan Mickey's got a hand up and Stephen Reicher is on. So let's bring in the real experts on this one.
I don't know about real experts, but Professor Liz Stokoe, who's in the behavioural group within IndySage, is busy developing and piloting a scheme. And we've got a couple of organisations that are interested in doing that. So I think that could have legs. But what it does require is national investment, because it requires having standards, having people sign up to those standards, having people who go and inspect premises to ensure that they're abiding by it, having a system for finding people some kind of sanctions if people aren't abiding by those standards. But when we go into a restaurant, by law, there is something on display showing us what the hygiene rating is, so we can decide whether we want to risk a 1 star in terms of hygiene rating. And I think it's blindingly obvious that the same thing should be happening with the quality of air, given that this pathogen is going to be with us for a long time. So I think it's really important that whatever position one is in society was really pushing to have the investment in the infrastructure to allow this to happen.
Thank you.
Could I just... Okay. No. Well, I was just very quickly just going to mention that there's a sort of lower level scores on the doors idea where if the restaurant has a way of just showing how much clean air is coming in, then it doesn't need inspectors to come in and check that. And that's one of the beautiful things about carbon dioxide displays, is they show how much fresh air you've got, how much you stop the numbers building up. So I think there is also a plan where at least they display how much clean air they're bringing in, and then it doesn't necessarily need inspectors to check.
Good point.
And Stephen Reicher, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, I want to make a slightly more general point, which is, at the moment, the government tells us it's up to us to stay safe. But in order for us to do that, we need a number of things. We need information. We need information about the fact there's still a risk. And I think one of the real problems is a lot of the communication is telling us it's all over and there is no risk. As Christina has shown us very clearly, it's not all over. Secondly, we need to understand the nature of transmission. And thirdly, we need to understand exactly what we can do and what spaces are safe. So in many ways, what we're doing here today, and I think Trish and Adam have been really useful, is what should be being done by the government. That information is necessary, because without that, saying to people, keep safe, be responsible, is utterly meaningless. On scores on the doors, it seems to me it's really important in order to ensure that everybody can participate in society. People need to know where is safe in order to know what spaces they can go into. What we're proposing, as Susan says, it's a very simple scheme. We're trialing it to see whether it works, to look at feedback from it and to refine it, both in one university and in a set of schools. And we've also been in conversation with the Scottish Government about rolling it out more generally. And what it will do in giving safety is, number one, I think it will allow more vulnerable people to come out in public. And one of the things that we've stressed again and again is the way in which the government talk about freedom is not freedom for all. In fact, it's imprisonment for many. And secondly, it will be good economically, because it will give people confidence to use bars, restaurants, and so on. So we will keep you posted about the scheme. Again, we're slightly sad that it's us who are doing it. It should be government who are doing it, but we'll be pressing them and we'll be arguing for it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice, as well, for getting in touch with that question. So I think we have maybe time for one last question, which has come in via Twitter from Tina Leonard. She'd like to know if there's a reliable handheld CO2 monitor that she could take with her when she needs to share air with others. So she's also immunosuppressed, and she's very cautious and wearing an FFP2 mask when sharing air indoors, but it'd be so nice to be able to have a coffee and a meal out. So if anyone had any recommendations for handheld CO2 monitors or any thoughts on that?
I was going to mention there's not a specific model, but the technology you're looking for is called NDIR. That type of CO2 monitor is more reliable. And there's quite a lot of those for about £100. The other thing I would add, because I suspect this is how I got COVID, is if you've got the face-to-face conversation, then even a reliably, beautifully low CO2 value. I think I was sat next to an open back door, but I was face-to-face with someone having a nice chat without a mask. So you do still need that distancing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So any last comments from anybody? That's it. That's a wrap then. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, yes. So thank you to Professor Christina Pagel, Professor Trish Greenhalgh, and Dr. Adam Squires for leading a very interesting and important discussion on clean air. Thank you to everybody for your questions, and thank you to everyone for watching, whether you're with us live or catching up. Thank you to all the experts on Independent Sage. Everyone is a volunteer making time for this because they think it's important to share data, analysis, and scientific opinion. And also because it's important for them to hear about perspectives, questions, and concerns from the public. So please do follow Independent Sage on Twitter if you don't already, and get in touch if you have any questions or comments. So we'll be back same time, same place next Friday. Stay safe and keep well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.